Our anthem today is with the Bell Choir, and it's Children of the Heavenly Father.
Wow, that was magnificent. And not only did you not miss a note, you had two modulations in the music. Oh my gosh. For those that are not musicians, that's tough to do because now all of a sudden you've changed to a whole different series of notes to play the same melody. And that's just fantastic. How many of you in the bell choir are new to bells? Could you raise? Say, hey, that's awesome. That is awesome. Terrific. And you too can be a bell ringer, I hear. Is that right? They just need to show up on Thursday nights for rehearsal?
Thursdays at 5:15? Yeah, 5:15, yeah.
Are we going to get out the big ones?
They're coming up, first.
Oh, see, we need a big husky person here to do that, so that'd be awesome. So I was thinking about this whole concept of humility, and I've got some illustrations here for you, but I was thinking that really the game that I think deals with humility the most would be maybe baseball players. So I happened to bring my jersey today, and they happen to be in the World Series. Anybody know that? Yeah. But then I thought, wait a minute, this is not a humble team because they keep winning. So I brought a real humble team today because I've been rooting for them for 40 years, and they've never won a World Series, so here you go. And it's not, by the way, the Blue Jays, but it would be the Pirates. No, oh, it's the Padres. How about that? So humility is where we recognize that we are not the greatest. Who said that? Let's see. There was a boxer. I am the greatest of all time. Who was that? Muhammad Ali. Who changed his name? Did you notice? He went from Cassius Clay, the most arrogant, I think, of all the boxers, to somebody who actually was the greatest in many ways, but he also was the most humble in other ways. And then this man who could not be beaten in the ring and who beat somebody that nobody thought would ever win, be beaten and have this title taken away from him as Cassius Clay, becoming Muhammad Ali. Then he ends up with Parkinson's. And then he realizes that there is no such thing as a greatest person. His own faith carried him to some statements later on about the humility of being somebody who's in the limelight or a celebrity. And I was thinking about all these people. I mean, I'm not feeling badly for anybody who gets up there and tries to hit a ball, because if you hit the ball a quarter of the time, which means you're paid to miss 3/4 of all the balls that are ever thrown at you, 3/4 of the time, for $100 million, $200, $400 million. And yet the highest paid baseball player in all of baseball, he gets up to the plate, and every time Ohtani hits a foul ball, do you know what he does? He says, "Are you okay over there in the stands?" He's worried when he hit one in a dugout that he almost killed one of the opposing players when they were in that particular stadium. And he stopped and he asked for timeout, because see, with the pitch clock now, you only get one of these timeouts as a batter. So he said, "Excuse me a second," and he actually walked over toward that dugout to check on the player in the opposing team to make sure that he was okay. That was his one break that he had. Then he came back to the plate and he hit a home run. So this was really kind of the juxtaposition. And how can you possibly be paid that much money and still have a humble attitude? Well, as Jesus is teaching us, we choose to humble ourselves. This is not something God can do for us. God cannot, continually embarrass us to the point where we humble ourselves, or that God is going to do the humbling for us. In fact, it's an attitude that we carry through our faith and through the way we live. George III of England, he was the king of England and the whole British Empire back in the days of the Revolutionary War. And when the loss of the colonies was imminent and he had to pull his troops out, after many deaths, we talk about many wars in this country, but the Revolutionary War was not the bloodiest, but it certainly was high up there, of ordinary people who had to step in and fight for something that was not even yet solidified. But as they lost that, he spent the rest of his life really concerned about how badly they were kicked out of this particular continent. And he actually couldn't say the word independence without stuttering. That's how George III ended up in his lifetime. But when the fighting stopped in England, King George and all of the royal cronies around him there in Europe, they were sure that George Washington would crown himself, and they actually used this title, Emperor of the World. Because from the British perspective, the world was ruled by the British Empire. They had the most land, they had the most servants, so to speak. They had the greatest natural resources. They could get it from anywhere, any corner of the earth, and any precious gem or metal that they needed was available to them through their reign in all these different countries. So they thought for sure George Washington, who was there and also then named president and elected by a Congress, but the whole idea there was that he would then become the king of the world. And when they found out that George Washington had made a public statement that as soon as he was done with his term, he was going to go back and be a farmer in Mount Vermont. That was his whole goal: serve the country well and go back and be a citizen of the nation that we have fought for. Wow. Humility is not something that comes easy, especially for those who are made to be important, right? And this is, in fact, I'm a little bit of a misstatement last week when I said we were done with Luke. We're not done with Luke. We were just done with the most difficult parts of Luke, because this one is straightforward. Jesus tells about the unjust judge last time, the persistent woman, remember? And she's constantly after him. And so finally he gives in because he knows that she's not going to go away. That parable was talking about, us being persistent in our faith and also being grateful that God has continued to love and bless us. Well, this week Jesus teaches about humility, which might be the final stop of a Christian journey. I was trying to think what would be the highest elevation of Christian faith. When do we know we've arrived? When do we know that the fruits of the Spirit in us are actually working their work? And in order for us to experience love, peace, and patience, and kindness and understanding, there's something in there that talks about our gratitude or our generosity. It's an idea where we humble ourselves enough that we know that the only thing we can possibly do, the greatest honor we could give God, is to give our lives to God. That's what God wants in the first place. That's the reason the whole story starts with a relationship between the Lord and two people, or at least two representatives of humanity. So if there's some sort of kind of benchmark for us on when we have reached some sort of maturity in our life, if that's humility, well, we got a problem, because if you've actually reached this high point of being great in your faith, that means that you're not great in your faith yet until you have humbled yourself. The person who becomes the servant. When I was the district superintendent, I know this is offensive to many of you, so I'll take this off. But Bishop Grant Hagia, Japanese American, his parents spent their time during World War II in one of our concentration camps here in the United States. His grandfather lost his life serving the country. Many people in his life have been involved in leadership. Bishop Grant, he's been, amongst those who would be considered, great political leaders. He has served as an advisor to many people. He's now the president of the School of Theology, Claremont School of Theology. He's, in my opinion, one of the most humble men I've ever met. And the first time as a district superintendent, we went to an event that was honoring him. It was at the Glendale Church. And there was a big banquet for him. And we were getting up. I'm hosting him in my district at that church. And ironically now, the assistant pastor who was at Palmdale is the senior pastor of that church. And, the world just turns and people continue to serve. But Bishop Grant, we were getting up to go get in line because the hostess was insisting that the bishop go first. And he said to her, "No, I always go last in the line. Is that okay?" She said, "No." And he said, "No, really, I go last in line." And he said, "No, I can't do that." She said, "You have to get in the front." And so he said, Okay. So he walks over to the food service table. He steps around the back side of it, and he's the first in line to serve the people who are coming through the line. And I'm thinking, I'm kind of hungry, but I'm not going to be the first to go through the line. So I end up standing over there with him. So we're done with this meeting that was all about him. This is all a welcome for him. And we were getting ready to go, and I reached over to grab one of the chairs, and so we started stacking. Like you do in a church, when you're done with that event, you're setting up for the next thing, right? So the people that are in charge, the guest speaker, the person who's the most, quote, honored in the room, those are the people that start to put away the chairs. But Bishop Grant, he walks over and grabs one of those tables. Now, he's 72 years old at this point, 70 years old at this point. And he walks over to one of those, not the real light little plastic little things over here, but he grabs one of those old wood tables. You remember those? They weigh like 800 pounds, you know, and they're horrible. You get splinters in the bottom and gum that people have been sticking there all those years. And he kicks that thing over, boom, and it hits the ground and folds those tables. And people are running over to help him. But they didn't realize that he gets up every morning. He runs 3 to 5 miles. He's fit. And he's ready to serve. And I so appreciate this man who actually was the one that tried to bring all of the United Methodist Church under one tent. He said, we can still do this. We can disagree on certain issues. We can disagree on human sexuality, but we do not have to leave the tent in order to do that. Let's stick together. And so he spent an extra 3 or 4 years just trying to pull the whole United Methodist Church worldwide together, which never actually transpired, but he believed in the one faith, one church. One of the most humble men I know, and still serving, as he's much older now in life, and he's still there because he believes in Christian education for all people. You see, humility is something we choose by the way we live. It's our attitude. It's not a fill in or check the box to show that we are humble. It is more about how we approach things. And so that's where we are today with our friend here, the Pharisee, and also the tax collector. And this is the lead-in statement. This is how Luke records this for us. To some who are confident in their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. So you see, he's standing there. He's already told them about this unjust judge and how justice will come if you persistently pray, if you stay with it, if you don't back off. And now he's coming around to those who feel like they have made it, that they have done everything they're supposed to do in their life. He's trying to teach Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes and high priests and all these people that are around him, judging him and trying to trap him and trying to have him make a mistake, all the way into the 18th chapter of Luke, which means we're getting near the end of Jesus' ministry and his ability to tell these stories and to talk to people. And so to some who are confident as he's standing there, we don't even know who that is, which is kind of a beautiful thing. We don't need to know who he's talking to because ultimately he's talking to us. Verse 10, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, so he probably caught the attention of those who were the teachers or lawyers in the room with him. And then the next one is the other, the tax collector. Now, as you know, tax collectors in these days were hated. They were Jewish people who were collecting taxes for Rome. They were hated by Rome because they're Jewish. They are hated by the Jews because they feel they're being unfairly taxed. Gosh, that sounds very similar to the beginning of the Revolutionary War, doesn't it? And so here they are going to the temple. This again, a parable. The Pharisee stood by himself and he prayed, God, thank you for me, that I am not like other people, robbers and evildoers, adulterers, and even this tax collector, like over here. Now, Jesus is not pulling any punches here, obviously. Twice a week I fast and give 1/10 of all that I get. Well, Pharisees actually had in something that was called the Rule of Christianity that was written by one of the earliest writers of Christian discipleship, probably first century. And in there it says that Pharisees are supposed to fast on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not Mondays and Wednesdays. Mondays and Wednesdays were supposed to be for work, for doing the work of God. But if you were going to have a Tuesday and a Thursday, that worked out very well because then you could fast on these days you're not working and you could still be prepared for the services that would happen on Saturday. You'd have a whole nother day of recovery. And then giving 1/10, well, that was required of Pharisees. But what this doesn't tell us as the full story that you're giving a tenth of a lot of money because you're collecting a percentage of everything that comes to the temple or the synagogue. So 10% for a Pharisee would have been a larger amount of money because they were not poor. They were not only fed by the money that they received, but they were fed because every time you brought a sacrifice, the Pharisees would get the first slice of the best of the lamb or the cow or whatever it was that was on that altar. All things were equally eaten, except, of course, for pork or anything with a cloven hoof. But this was the idea that the barbecue that happened was to feed the Pharisee and their family and would also take care of all the other people that were in the temple at the time. So here he is in this pride as Jesus tells this story. But the tax collector stood not just alone, but he stood at a distance. Didn't even want to get near the front. Now the temple court, there were 3 temple courts. There was a public one, that was where the women were allowed. There was an inner one, that's where people that were considered higher Jews or of the Jewish elevation sort of worship. I mean, there's a group today called Elevation Worship, and every time I hear their name, I'm thinking about those who could get to the second part of the courtyard. They could get up the steps to make sure they were in this part up here. But oddly enough, Pharisees were not considered the highest of Jews because they were in charge of the synagogues. Pharisees were the ones that were out in the community temples or the synagogues, the place where Jews would gather to have worship. The people that were running the temple in Jerusalem were called the Sadducees. And they were the ones who were even ready to go to the final court, or where the high priests would be. And the high priest would then be to the entrance of the Holy of Holies. My point is, if you stood at a distance, he might have actually not even been to the upper level. And this is a story, it's a parable, it didn't actually happen, but we're just imagining a man who stands off in the corner. And he can do nothing but stand there and pound his breast. This was a sign of shame. This was I'm not worthy. This is, nobody cares about me. And as he's pounding his chest, all he could say is, God, have mercy on me. You know the songs, Kyrie eleison. It's Greek for Lord, have mercy. Christo eleison. Christ, have mercy on me. It's the only thing he could say. But then he says one more thing. A sinner. He names himself. So it is a hated person who becomes the one who confesses, who's confessional, and he's asking for forgiveness. He's asking for mercy from God. So it's not what they've done with their life. It's the fact that the attitude that he remains with, even though he is a wealthy man, and he is equally hated by many, he's still a person who comes knowing that he is who he is. I tell you this man, the tax collector, rather than the other man, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. Not what we do, it's the attitude by which we do it. And this is the closer for Jesus. For all who exalt, in fact, read this with me. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. You notice this has nothing to do with the way God feels about you. This has nothing to do with how much God has blessed you or not blessed you. As if God would not bless you. When you start to ask, and God is there to respond to us, it's about what we're doing with our own lives. It's how we humble ourselves. It's not how we come to God with more or less than somebody else. And so often as human beings, it's easy for us to compare ourselves to others. That's why it's so easy for us to talk about how good we are, because we're sitting in church on a Sunday morning and we're not out there someplace doing something terrible to other people. This is our call to understand that we are the ones that define how we relate to the Lord, and more importantly, how we relate as the Lord's children to other people. To humble ourselves. There was a boy who goes and visits his cousin. Now, the boy lives in the city, and his cousin lives on the farm. And as they're sitting there, right before harvest, it's a summertime break, and so they're sitting out there, and the boys are looking over the wheat field. And the one boy looks at the other, the city boy, and he says, I bet that those tall stalks of wheat are the premier wheat. They stand tall. And then those other ones that are just sort of laying on the ground, he says, I'm sure that you throw those away. And his cousin, the farmer, smiles to himself because he knows the truth. He says, come here. So they walk over there and they pick the stalk off the tallest, and they pick the stalk off the one that's bowed down onto the ground, and he rubs them together, and out of his hand comes very few seeds from the stalk that is tall. Where all the seeds are is the one that's fulfilled, the one that is actually full of wheat. And then that is the place where it ends up. He can't bear to stand tall any longer because they're so full of what people need that their only position is the ground. I think every time we turn around, we're going to see illustrations of how humility wins and how people who are humble are the ones that we want to hang around with. I mean, you would never want to be friends with somebody that's better than you are, would you? Not if they talk about it every day. Look how good I am. Look, this is the dilemma for us. Humility is the thing we choose. It's not what God can do for us, and yet it might be the final step. And the moment we think we've reached the final step of Christian maturity and we think that we're something, we're not humble, therefore we got to start all over again. So the top takes you to the bottom, and the bottom takes you to the top. Or how did Jesus say it? The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. I think Bishop Grant was working toward being the last so he could continue to be the last. But I'm sure God feels differently about the work that this person's done for the church over all these years. A humble life is something we choose. It's an attitude we have. It's to know that the only way we get access to some of the people that we love is when we become their servant, not when we become their supervisor. And so having the responsibility of being a supervisor, as do many people, that's one thing. You got to fulfill your job description, but to do it with humility is a whole nother level. Think of the most famous person you've ever met. Anybody here got a famous person that you've met? Yes. Yeah. Johnny Erickson Tata. She's actually dined with presidents and has been an advisor to several in terms of how we care for people in our country. She was behind ADA requirements for people and buildings and places where people could not get access to, and yet how has she spent her life? She said at the age of whatever it was, 18 or 19, she told us this story when we were meeting with her once. And she said, this is what God told me as I was done with my crying. You find somebody that is worse off than you are, and then you go serve them. And then you go serve them. Yeah. The vice president of Coca-Cola. I mean, this guy's way up there. He actually had some relationships with the original Coca-Cola family that pours all this money into Atlanta particularly, and into the school I went to, Emory University. And he was vice president, and he was coming to our church in North Georgia. And he went on a mission trip with us. And he said, I'd like to pay for the whole thing. Everybody's got to shell out $1,000 to go on this mission trip. How about if I pay for everybody? I said, no. I don't think that's the goal here. I think everybody needs some skin in the game, so why don't you let them all pay? And if we have some shortfall, by all means, write a check for us. That would be great. And he came away from this mission trip realizing that the greatest thing he'd ever done was help build an outhouse for a 90-year-old woman who lives in the hollers of West Virginia. He says, I've never felt more alive than doing this job for this person. And sure enough, when we got back, he had to take a week of vacation to do this. This was back when vice presidents actually held themselves accountable. And so he said, well, I got to go back to work, but I'm sure going to look at my work a little differently than I did before. And I thought, win. This is a win for us as a church. And guess who organized the next trip the year later back to the hollers of the Appalachian Mountains in something called the Appalachian Service Project? Around here you have the Sierra Service Project, but it's about where we serve. It's about where we go. It's about how we do it and where we are involved in other people's lives. Look, we're all working on humble responses to others. We would love for people to love to be around us. If we find ourselves, telling stories about how great we are, those are the stories that just drive people further away from us. When we approach every relationship like we've got the answer and the other person is always in the wrong, we find our relationships getting harder and harder every time. So it's not how you win the argument, it's whether or not you heard the other person. I know it feels good once in a while to walk away from an argument knowing you're right, but you will also be alone. So are you going to be right and alone, or are you going to be together and you're going to work it through as you do life together? This is the challenge we live with all the time. How do you find humility and at the same time do good things for God? I don't have the answer, but I do have a song. Because in 1978, this person decided that they were going to write a song about how we go about humbling ourselves. Because you can't humble somebody else unless you want to embarrass them or somehow make them feel less than they are. And I guess that's a possibility, but that never is a win-win situation. We've tended to get really mean in our country in recent years. We think that the way to raise ourselves up is by putting somebody else down, and this is the exact opposite of what Jesus teaches. This was at that campfire that brought so many people into a relationship with Christ, and I might have been one of those. Maybe you know this. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. And he shall lift you up higher and higher, and he shall lift you up. You know it? All right, so if you know it, you're the echo, all right? Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. And he shall lift you up higher and higher, and he shall lift you up. Oh, that was beautiful. Let's do this again. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. And he shall lift you up higher and higher, and he shall lift you up higher and higher, and he shall lift you up. Lord, we just ask today that you would remind us of how much you love us and provide for us. And as we give our lives back to you, as we give our treasures, as we give our hearts, as we give our prayers, may we do this humbly, knowing that we are not anything without you, and we are everything with you. And we thank you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. That was beautiful. We might do that again sometime.